Hello, my darlings. My name is Barbie. I am made of plastic, but that you probably already know. You might think that I am one of the first products made of plastic, but actually this miraculous material was invented way before I was born. Come with me and I will show you the short history of plastic. It's fantastic. People often mistake to think that plastic was invented around the 1950s, but the very first forms of plastic take us way back in history, all the way to the ancient times. Shellac, an organic polymer and resin produced by an insect called Caryolaca, was used by ancient Egyptians 1000 BC to balsam the linen cloths of mummies. Keeping moist and air away from the mummy, it had many similar properties with the modern plastics of today, and can be seen as one of the very first forms of plastic, even though completely organic. 2,856 years later, Alexander Parkes invented what is today seen as the very first man-made plastic. His invention, called Parkesine, was a celluloid-based plastic material. It was unveiled at the 1862 World's Fair in London, and earned his inventor a bronze medal in the fair. A little bit over a decade later, in 1869, John Wesley Hyatt discovered a method to simplify the production of celluloid, making its industrial production possible. During those times, ivory was used in many products, but due to its high price, manufacturers tried to find cheaper substitutes with similar properties to replace it. A New York-based company offered $10,000 for anyone who could provide them a material to replace ivory in billiard balls, and in the end Mr. Hyatt won the prize with his invention. After that, celluloid was used, for example, in most movie and photography films until the 1950s. In 1897, a new material had its dawn when Wilhelm Krisch and Adolf Spittler developed Galilith. It was a casein and formaldehyde-based plastic, meaning that it was derived from milk proteins. It was used in buttons and piano keys, but although it was cheap, it didn't keep its popularity for long, as the restrictions of World War II led to a need for milk as a food. Jumping into a new century, Bakelite was the first one to start a new era of modern plastics. Developed by Leo Bakelite in 1907, it was the first fully synthetic fossil fuel-based plastic made from phenol and formaldehyde. Unlike Parkesine, it was a thermosetting polymer, meaning it could be molded only once. At this point, it is important for you to know that there are two types of plastics: thermosetting polymers and thermoplastics. Thermosetting polymers are plastics that can melt and take shape only once, and after they have solidified, they stay solid. Thermoplastics, on the other hand, do not undergo any chemical change in their composition when heated, and can therefore be molded again and again. But back to the story. In the early years of the 18th century, not much development happened until 1926. That is when PVC, one of the most toxic plastics still used today, was first taken to use. Like many other plastics, it was already invented accidentally in the 17th century, but its potential and possible uses were not realized until later. In the 1930s, things started to get more serious when the manufacturing of different kinds of plastics really took off. More plastic products started appearing in the market, and for example, vinyl records were introduced for the first time. In the 30s, an American company called DuPont also opened their game in the plastic industry with their many innovations, including polyester, neoprene, nylon, and Teflon. When the Second World War broke out at the end of the decade, the production of plastics in America increased by 300%. Plastic had an important role in the war, since it enabled the production of products such as parachutes, powder bags, and tires. Moving to the 40s, things started to escalate, and plastic really became the material of the modern kitchen. PET was invented and DuPont licensed it. First plastic bottles were born. In the mid-century, Tupperware containers and thin plastic wraps changed the way of cooking and preserving food, and in the end of the century, the first National Plastic Exhibition was held in New York, showcasing the great plastic inventions of the 40s. In the 1950s, things kept speeding up when new material innovations kept on coming. Many familiar plastics of today, such as polyester and polypropylene, were first taken to use in the 50s. 1959 was also a remarkable year, because I was born. And a little fun fact I'd like to share, Barbies and many other toys are still today made of PVC, even though it is known to be toxic. But moving forward to the 1960s. That was the decade when things really started to take a turn and first concerns of the environmental effects of plastic started lifting their head. It was the year 1960 that plastic debris were first discovered in the oceans, and attitudes towards the almighty plastic really started to change. It was no longer seen as unambiguously positive, but also associated with things that were seen as cheap, flimsy, or fake. Despite the turmoil, new innovations such as HDPE bottles and bubble wraps kept on coming, not to even mention DuPont, who patented so many new plastics between 1950s to 1970s that I can't even remember. In the end of the decade, a major oil spill in California coast made headlines, and the awareness of environmental issues kept on spreading. 1970s continued the path that the 60s had started, and the health impacts of plastic began to be questioned even more. PVC was discovered to be cancerous, and the use of a plastic called acrylonitrile was banned in bottles. Coca-Cola and Pepsi had replaced glass with plastic in their bottles in 1975, and until the ban, Coca-Cola bottles were made of acrylonitrile. In the 70s, the pace of new innovations slowed down a bit, but still one of the most controversial products of today. The infamous plastic bag was first taken to use in grocery stores in the US in 1979. And a little fun fact from the 70s. 1973 has been the only time in history when the annual increase of the production of plastics has went down temporarily, due to the oil crisis of that year. Moving on to the 80s, things really kept on changing, and actions towards environmentalism were taken. First biodegradable plastic bag was invented, and so was the triangular recycling symbol. In 1987, recycling became a media phenomenon through what is known as the garbage barge. A cargo ship from New York with 3,000 tons of waste sailed around for months, finally returning back from where it left, since nobody accepted to take the waste and dispose it. Despite the media attention of recycling issues, the production of plastic passed the production of steel by volume in 1989. In the beginning of the 90s, attitudes towards plastic were really in crossroads. It had completely integrated into everyday life and enabled a new standard of living, but at the same time the resistance against the use of it kept rising. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch, a drifting mass of plastic the size of Texas, was discovered in the Pacific Ocean. Clothing from recycled plastic bottles were first established, and even Coca-Cola attempted to blend recycled plastics into its bottles. However, one of the great villains of today, the microbeads, were introduced in cosmetics for the first time, and they were truly miraculous. Opinions about plastic had divided. Coming to the new millennium, things took a gradual turn, and plastic was recognized to soon become one of the biggest problems our society is facing. New, more environmentally friendly substitutes for plastic, such as PLA, made from cornstarch, were being invented, while the drastic increase in plastic consumption had made the environmental effects of plastic more visible than ever. Bangladesh banned the use of plastic bags as the first country in the world in 2002, after discovering they blocked drains during a severe flood. The first study of microplastics in freshwater ecosystems were made in 2011, and during that time the new term really started raising concerns amongst consumers, realizing for the first time where their beloved microbead consisting cosmetic products end up. Shortly after, Netherlands banned the use of microbeads in 2014, and that was only the beginning for the microbead persecute to come. By the way, if you didn't know, there are two types of microplastics: primary and secondary. Primary being products purposely made the size of 5 millimeters or less, and secondary being small pieces of plastic derived from the breakdown of larger plastic debris. Back to the story. In 2017, BBC's documentary Blue Planet 2 raised awareness with striking footage of how plastic affects ocean animals. Coincidental or not, in the same year a study by Lund University showed that nanoplastics cause brain damage in fish. In 2018, things do not necessarily look brighter for marine life, but actions are being taken. While microplastics have been discovered to spread via flying insects, infinitely recyclable plastics are being developed, in the hopes of ending the production of new plastic. At the same time, big associations and government-level organizations are stepping into the discussion. EU is, for example, working on banning plastic straws, cutlery and plates, and Earth Day Network aims to end plastic pollution by 2020. Is this the end? I hope not. Now is the time for you humans to make a change. A change in attitudes, behaviors, and everyday habits, because you are now in a point of no return. You need to implement a new way of living in order to put a stop to the plastic pollution. Plastic can and will exist with you on this planet, but the way you use it is what counts. Reducing, reusing, and recycling are the steps that every single one of you can and should take into account in your everyday choices. I do not look that fresh anymore, but I will be here forever, at least in some form. After all, I am made of plastic. You, however, won't be here for long as a species, unless you take matters in your own hands, now. The humankind has all the tools to stop plastic from destroying this planet, and now is the time to start using them. You are worth it. Okay, this is it for now, darlings. Say toodaloo.
Work it out, Barbie.
XOXO. Barbie.